Hello and welcome. My name is Brian Kramer.
And I'm Ebony Walton.
In this poster session, we will present data for the nation, states, and select districts on how students performed on NAEP, math and reading grades 4 and 8 over the last 30 years, emphasizing the score declines we've seen for lower performing students since 2013.
Before we look at some of the data, I would like to introduce the Nation's Report Card, or NAEP, to those of you who may not know about the program. NAEP has been in operation for over 50 years. It is federally mandated to assess students' knowledge and skills in multiple subjects, and we measure students' knowledge across the country at elementary, middle, and high school levels. In recent years, we have been mandated to assess 4th and 8th graders in mathematics and reading every 2 years, and we also assess 12th graders in mathematics and reading every 4. With additional funding and with other objectives as set by the National Assessment Governing Board, we do measure students' knowledge and skills in other subject areas.
And NAEP is also a holistic measure that assesses students' knowledge and skills in more than just math and reading. It also assesses students in such things as science, civics, and US history, among other subjects. Finally, NAEP is a gold standard in large-scale assessments because of what NAEP assesses and how it assesses students. The first finding that we want to discuss is that average scores declined in grades 4 and 8 mathematics and reading since 2013. Let's look at math grade 4 first. This graph is showing average scores. The first assessment year for math was 1990. The asterisks refer to scores that were significantly different from 2019, and the scale score is from 0 to 500. Turning to the data, the 2019 score was higher than the scores in the 1990s and early 2000s. However, the 2019 score is lower than the score in 2013. Since that time, scores dipped a bit and then increased 1 point from 2017 to 2019, though the 2019 score is still lower than the 2013 score. Now, let's look at math grade 8. Similar to grade 4, the 2019 Math 8 score was higher than the scores in the 1990s and early 2000s. However, the 2019 score was lower than the scores in 2011 and 2013, where we see that peak. Since that time, scores have been lower.
Moving to reading, here is our trend line of average scores that date back to 1992. As in the previous charts, anytime you see an asterisk, that asterisk indicates that the score for 2019 is statistically different from the score with the asterisk. And as you can tell, there has been some modest gains made by 4th graders from 2019 compared to the earlier years in 1990s and the early 2000s. However, there are no score differences between 2019 and 2007, 2009, and 2011. In the last 6 years, the scores in 2013, 15, and 2017 were higher than the score in 2019. For grade 8 reading, we see similar stories as in the average scores for 2019 were higher than the earliest year in 1992 and in 1994. However, we see some indications where there were no differences in the score compared to 2019 in the 90s and in some years in the early 2000s. I will point out that in 2013, the score was 268, which was significantly higher than the score in 2019. And that score was the highest point, and students have not reached that level in the subsequent years.
Now let's summarize what we just presented. We saw average score gains from the early 1990s until 2013 across all 4 assessments. After 2013, however, scores have declined in all 4 assessments.
For our second finding, we're going to look a little bit underneath the hood. We're going to look at how students performed across the performance distribution as defined by our percentiles. In these results, you'll see that that lower performing students actually declined between 2013 and 19, while higher performing students had a different pattern. Here are the percentile scores for grade 4 mathematics since 1990. The percentiles that we have data for are for students who are at the 10th and 25th percentile, those students who are at the lower end of the distribution. We have scores for students at the 50th percentile, those who are middle performing. And then we also have scores for students who score at the 90th and at the 75th percentiles. Those are our higher performing students. Again, with the asterisks, you'll see that the scores in 2019 were higher than the scores than in the 90s and early 2000s. But when you get to 2013, you'll notice a different pattern. You'll see that the students at the 10th and 25th, the lower two lines, have average scores that are lower in 2019 than they were in 2013. But students at the 90th, our highest performing students, actually made gains. This pattern was also seen in grade 8 mathematics, where in 2013, the higher performing students made a score gain, while the lower performers had a score decline.
Reading is a slightly different story from mathematics. Let's look at reading grade 4 first. There were modest gains from 1992 to 2013 across the performance distribution. However, how these gains were made differed across the percentiles. At the 10th percentile, for example, there was a lot of movement in the 1990s and early 2000s, relatively large decreases and increases. Gains at the 75th and 90th percentiles were different in that they were more gradual over time. Turning to the more recent years, from 2013 to 2019, we see score declines for lower performers and no score changes for higher performers. Let's now look at reading grade 8. Similar to grade 4, there were score gains across the distribution from 1992 to 2013, with more fluctuations for lower performers than higher performers. What's different from reading grade 8 compared to the other assessments is that scores at all percentiles except the 90th declined from 2013 to 2019. To summarize, we see both average scores and scores for lower and higher performers increasing from the early 1990s to 2013 for all of the assessments. However, it's a different story from 2013 to 2019. Here, average scores are declining along with scores at the 10th percentile, while scores at the 90th percentile are either improving or unchanged. Importantly, we see diverging score trends between the lower and higher performers in mathematics, grades 4 and 8.
After looking at the results for the nation and seeing the pattern of the 10th percentile declining in many of these subjects while higher performers improving or holding steady, we wondered how that pattern held across different student groups. For this slide, we looked at the score changes among students by their race ethnicity. Here's a table with indications of whether or not a score decreased in the 10th percentile or 90th percentile with the down arrow, or if a score increased at the 10th or 90th percentile with an up arrow. At the far left, you see the score changes between 2013 and 2019 for the 10th and 90th percentiles of white students. As you see in the chart, the lower performing students, those who scored at the 10th percentile, had declines in all 4 assessments for white students. On the other hand, their highest performing students, those performing at the 90th percentile, had score gains in mathematics at grades 4 and 8. Looking at the next set of columns, you'll see the score changes for Black students. Again, you see that their lower performing students, those who scored at the 10th percentile, had a score decline across the board, while their highest performing students, those performing at their 90th percentile, had a score gain in grade 4 mathematics. Hispanic students had a similar story where their 10th percentile scores declined in grades 4 and 8 mathematics, and there was also a decline in grade 8 reading. However, students in the 90th percentile had an increase in grade 4 mathematics and grade 8 reading. For students who are Asian or Pacific Islander, we saw no change in their 10th percentile scores in any of the assessments. but their 90th percentile had score gains in grades 4 and 8 mathematics. Finally, while we don't have a lot of change for American Indian, Alaska Native, or 2 or more races, given how large their sample size is, we do detect some declines in their 10th percentiles. I would like to point out that many times when you see these opposing arrows where the 10th percentile is declining while the 90th percentile is increasing, you'll see for those student groups that the average score did not change. With this analysis, we're able to say that it's not necessarily the case that these student groups didn't have performance changes, but what has happened is that their performance distribution is pulling apart.
Our last finding is that a few states and trial urban districts, or TUDAs, experienced diverging score trends among their low and high performing students. Let's first look at states and other jurisdictions. The colors in this graphic indicate average and percentile score changes from 2013 to 2019. The pink indicates a significant score decline. The green, a significant score increase, and the white indicates no significant score change. As you can see, there are more red than green on the screen, a troubling indicator. This slide is showing those few jurisdictions that made score gains across the performance distribution for both lower and higher performing students. For DC and Mississippi, this was in grade 4 mathematics and reading. And for the Department of Defense schools, abbreviated DODEA, this was in grade 4 mathematics. Unfortunately, some states had score declines across the performance distribution, such as Vermont in all 4 assessments, and New Hampshire and Maryland in 3 of the assessments. And there were a lot of states with score declines at the 10th through the 50th percentiles. In these states, declines were typically for lower performing students, while higher performing students held steady. Finally, a few states demonstrated diverging score trends. Scores for their 10th percentile students declining, while scores for their 90th percentile students improving. We see this with Pennsylvania in mathematics grades 4 and 8.
In addition to state data, we also collect data for students who live in large urban districts. And before I show you those specific district data, let's look at how students in large cities performed nationally. These are students who live in cities with over 250,000 people. On average, we see no change in their scores from 2013 to 2019 in 3 of the 4 assessments, but a decline for grade 8 reading. Across the performance distribution, however, we see that students in the 10th and 25th percentiles had declines almost across the board. And we also see a decline in grade 8 mathematics for their middle performing students. Higher performing students in large cities, those who scored at the 75th and 90th percentiles, had no score change. So here are the urban districts for which we have data going back to 2013. As Brian indicated, when you see light red shading, it indicates a score decline either for the average score or for a percentile score. Or when you see a light green shading, it means that there was a score gain. Here are the districts with the yellow dotted line in which their higher and lower performing students actually made gains. DCPS had gains almost across the board in grades 4, mathematics, and reading, while Miami made across the board gains in grade 4 mathematics. In this slide, we highlight the districts in which their lower performing students, those who score below the 75th percentile, had score declines. And you see there are a few instances where just the 10th percentile made a decline. Austin in grade 8 reading, for instance, or Austin in grade 4 mathematics. There are cases where several of their lower performing groups had declines, but the average score didn't change. In the case of grade 8 reading for Houston, we see that their 10th and 25th percentiles declined, but the average score was marked as unchanged. And finally, here are 2 instances in which we see divergence among the districts. In grade 8 mathematics, Austin and New York City had their lower performing students at the 10th and 25th percentiles decline, while their highest performing students, those at the 90th, have a score increase, but their average scores showed no change.
Now let's summarize our key findings. First, we saw that average scores were higher in 2019 than they were in the 1990s and early 2000s. However, since around 2013, scores have been declining and they are now lower in 2019.
The changes that you see between 2013 and 2019 differ according to how students perform in the distribution. Lower performing students made declines nationally, while higher performing students either held steady or made improvements.
Finally, the third main finding that we discussed is that there were a few states and districts with diverging trends. Scores for their lower performing students declining, while scores for their higher performers increasing.
So that concludes our presentation. We showed a lot of data, but trust us, there are many more data points for you to explore at nationsreportcard.gov.
Thank you.